welcome to LIFT, the LCI Group Fireside Series. LIFT stands for Learning, Innovation, Future and Transitions. 4 words that define how global education evolves and transforms lives. I'm your host, Suneetha Qureshi, Global Director, University Engagement at LCI Group. Through the series, we'll explore ideas shaping international education, from rethinking recruitment to redefining collaboration and most importantly, what it means for students. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Alaric Rae, Deputy Director of External Relations and Director of Student Recruitment at the University of Birmingham. Alaric, welcome to LIFT.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me, Suneetha. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so I think as we just get started, please do let us know what first drew you into international education.
Blimey, there's a question. So my background is very much in education. I pursued my undergraduate degree, but then went on to pursue a master's degree and indeed a PhD. And I harboured aspirations to be an academic. I think, if truth be told, Suneetha, I probably wasn't a very good academic. Actually, I think my people skills were probably far stronger than my academic skills, despite managing to achieve a PhD. So I found myself working for an international examinations board. I had marked A-level scripts as a PhD student to earn extra money. So I'd gained some experience of the qualifications, got a job working for an international examinations board, and then found myself working for one of the biggest education companies in the world, Pearson, and worked for Pearson for a number of years in an international education business development role. You know, whilst universities are a very unique type of business, that's why they're called, universities rather than businesses or companies. They are a type of business. So with that strong education background and a strong international education kind of commercial background, that led me to a role at the University of Birmingham that I enjoy hugely and have been doing for over 10 years now.
That's so good to hear. So what keeps you inspired today? What keeps you inspired in your current role in this sector?
I think there's probably two aspects. There for me is undoubtedly just a real sense of passion and pride to be able to work for an institution and in a sector that does just so much good for the world. Not only do we help young people to gain the skills, knowledge, experience that they need to go on and live fulfilling and successful lives. Universities like Birmingham do a tremendous amount of research, which of course inevitably is all about public good. So I've a sense of pride, feeling like I'm working for an organisation in a university that's doing an enormous amount of good. And then, of course, actually, there's something a little bit more personal, which is about the challenging nature of what we do. One of the things that keeps universities on their toes is that they have to compete with each other, and that keeps universities continually, striving to improve what they do. And in the aspect of the university that I look after, in essence, attracting the brightest and best students from all around the world, that's a hugely competitive thing, and that really keeps me on my toes. And there are lots of challenges that we face in doing that work, whether those challenges are geopolitical, whether they're governmental policy challenges. I feel personally really challenged. So two sides there. I hope that's a reasonable answer.
Yes, I mean, that's of course inspirational. The journey is very rich. It brings us to the L in LIFT, that's learning.
Yeah.
So, what has been your most important lesson working with the international students? International students, they kind of bring the best in us, and this sector is always evolving. So, what's the most important lesson working with them?
The biggest lesson for me is that universities, people that do roles like mine, and people in the sector, the work in universities, not necessarily that work, in different countries around the world, helping to support students in making their decisions, but people that work in universities. One of the huge mistakes that we make is talking about international students like they're homogenous. Like they all have a shared set of but behaviours, drivers. That's so untrue. And you can even fall into the trap, of stereotyping or characterising, students from different countries, international students from different countries, thinking that their motivations, their behaviours are all kind of consistent and stereotyped. They're not, and the motivations, for example, of Indian students and Chinese students may, generally speaking, be a little different. They certainly are different, a little different. If you speak to two individual, Chinese students or two individual Indian students, actually their motivations will be completely different. What matters to them will be completely different. So the biggest lesson I've learned actually is that international students are not homogenous. We should not treat them so. I don't actually like the label international students because it does put us into this situation where we end up thinking about international students as a homogenous group. No, everybody's individual, everybody's personal motivations, what matters to them is fundamentally different. And for all of us working in the sector, actually that's critical, right? If you don't take the time to understand and learn about an individual, student's interests, motivations, what's important to them, what's important to their parents, then we're doing those individuals a misservice when we talk to them. So that's an easy question. That's my single biggest thing I've learned.
Thank you. And the spirit of learning brings us to I at innovation. Now, HE sector is continuously evolving. There are new changes coming up, different policies are coming up. So what changes or innovations in the sector excite you the most?
Great question. It would be easy to turn to, technology, artificial intelligence, perhaps the different platforms and digital services, perhaps even digital education. Actually, for me, that wouldn't be where I'd turn. I think probably the most exciting innovations I'm seeing at the moment, and my university, I'm proud to say, is quite heavily involved in some of these innovations, is the way that we're increasingly thinking about what's important to students, what's important to international students when it comes to employability, and the innovations that are happening actually around the employability service that universities are starting to offer, students. I think for too long, the way that universities have treated international students has been that they've provided a service for students whilst the students were, studying and in country, but for those students that either choose to return home, or for whatever reason are unsuccessful in finding employment at home, in the UK and end up going home, in many cases that support had finished. The support was provided to students, at the university and nowhere else. And for me, some of the most exciting innovations are happening where, actually universities are thinking about how they need to service and support students beyond graduation around employability and into that whole life cycle, which, to be perfectly frank, from a university's perspective, we're far more likely to have highly engaged and highly influential alumni, if we support them beyond their time at university. And for me, that absolutely includes thinking about supporting employability, perhaps if they return to their home country. That's something we've been investing a lot of time and effort in Birmingham, and we haven't been doing it alone. We've been innovating, we've been doing it with partner universities, we've been doing it with partner service providers, in different countries around the world, reflecting really that heavy importance that students are placing on return on investment. Return on investment. If you're going to spend 50,000-60,000 pounds equivalent on a degree plus accommodation plus living expenses per year, then that return on investment is critical. And that service beyond simply, the time that you study. So that would be probably the example I'd tell you. Like I said, it's not, that's not about AI, that's not about technology. That's about understanding what's important to students and focusing more efforts on, supporting them that way.
Coming to the F in LIFT, that's future. It would be easy to ask what will be the future of the international education in 5 to 10 years, but I think since the sector is evolving so drastically, so I think it's better to ask, what do you think would be the future of international education the next 2 to 3 years? There are a lot of changing policies coming in. UK, of course, is a favorable destination for students. And what do you think, according to you, would happen in the coming years?
Another great question. So some universities, both in the UK, Australian universities, less so American universities, perhaps some, are increasingly positioning themselves as global universities, as global brands. And what they're doing is they're not only offering access to their education within the country from which they originated, but they're starting to offer degrees in other locations. That's something that the University of Birmingham is already doing. So, as of today, it is possible to study for a University of Birmingham degree, of course, in Dubai, where we have a flagship campus. It's possible to study for a University of Birmingham degree in Singapore, in China. I think that's a trend. I think that's a trend that has the potential to continue. But as part of that trend, it's so important actually that universities continue to reflect on students' motivations. What is it students are looking for, and sometimes simply lifting and shifting the provision of a degree from one country to another won't meet students in that particular country's needs. So there's a lot of nuancing that needs to be done there, Suneetha. It's a trend. I think it's a big part of the future. But I think we'll see some successes, some failures actually over the course literally of the next few years.
Yeah, but it's a changing time, transition, I would say, and
that's
the final element of LIFT is transitions. So how can institutions better support students through transitions?
Oh, crikey. I touched upon earlier, the importance of, career services. I think that's part of it. But look, for me, it's about thinking about the entire, student life cycle. So actually, for international students, the transition from, living in one country, moving in some instances halfway around the world to living in a different country, a different culture, with people they don't know, often an education system that's unfamiliar. That's a really big transition, and I think universities can really help with that by, creating the environment, creating communities, providing support to help nurture students through that transition. It isn't surprising that, actually what happens when you look at the performance of students, and the performance of international students in particular. International students will really struggle to perform academically during the first few months, of their time. Because of course they've been through a massive transition, right? Moving, in many cases halfway around the world. It takes time to settle. It takes time to become familiar, and then there's that big transition, out of education and either into employment or potentially further education, and the importance of the support there. And I think universities have got to be just increasingly cognizant of the fact that, the world is changing so incredibly quickly. The world of employment is changing so incredibly quickly, and knowledge is perhaps secondary to skills, and by skills. I'm not really talking about vocational skills. I'm talking about the softer skills. If you talk to employers, the things that employers will focus on are things like resilience, adaptability to change. And to help students with transitions, universities have got to be making sure that the education and environment we provide, help students to develop that, those skills, those softer skills that will make those transitions for them much smoother. It's something I think we are getting right at the University of Birmingham, but we're being kept on our toes. Like I said, Suneetha, when you step back, the world is just changing so quickly.
It's ever evolving, and there's so much of change coming in. We're just going to wrap up, but let's have a quick rapid fire. Just the first thought that comes to your mind.
Oh, crikey. Okay.
A book or a podcast or an article that you'd like to recommend?
A book would probably be How to Make People Say Yes. That's a little sinister, but yeah, How to Make People Say Yes.
What is one piece of advice that you'd like to give the international student?
Okay, I would say to international students that you're not just paying for, your lectures, your seminars, you're paying for access to an enormous range of, services, facilities. Make the most of them. So actually, relatively speaking, a large proportion of international students don't.
And one myth about international education that you'd like to burst. One myth.
Okay, a myth would be that, as an international student, the food that I really like, I'm not going to be able to get as an international student.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Alaric, and thank you so much for sharing your insights. And today's conversation reminds all of us that meaningful partnerships are not just built on transactions, but on trust and shared purpose and a deep commitment to students. To everyone watching, thank you for joining us. Stay tuned for more conversations in the Lift Fireside Series, where we'll continue to explore the learning, innovation, and future transitions shaping international education. Alaric, thank you very much for being a part of today's episode, and thank you so much for your time.
A pleasure, and thanks again.